For almost a decade, the auto industry repeated the same prediction over and over again. Gasoline would disappear, diesel would die, and electric vehicles would take over everything from family cars to massive freight trucks. It sounded inevitable. Governments backed it. Investors poured billions into it. Startups became overnight giants just by promising battery-powered futures. And old engine companies. Most people assumed they were slowly becoming obsolete. But behind closed doors, something unexpected was happening inside the trucking industry. The companies responsible for moving food, fuel, medicine, and almost everything people buy every day were running into a problem nobody wanted to admit publicly. The future looked impressive in presentations, but much harder in the real world. And that's exactly where Cummins saw an opportunity. Not by trying to out-Tesla Tesla, not by pretending batteries had already solved every problem, but by asking a much simpler question. What if the world isn't ready to abandon engines yet? That question led to one of the most controversial moves in modern transportation. Because while everyone else was racing toward electric trucks, Cummins spent years building a completely different kind of machine, one that quietly threatened the assumption that batteries were the only path forward. And the strange part is, the industry may actually need it more than people realize. The story really starts with a problem most consumers never think about. Long-haul trucking operates under brutal conditions. Trucks don't just drive across cities. Some travel thousands of miles every single week, carrying enormous loads through heat, mountains, freezing temperatures, and non-stop schedules. Every minute matters. Every delay costs money. And unlike passenger cars, trucking companies don't buy vehicles based on trends. They buy them based on survival. If a truck spends too long charging, profits disappear. If range becomes unpredictable, routes collapse. If maintenance gets complicated, entire fleets become liabilities. That's why many logistics companies became nervous much earlier than the public realized. Because while electric trucks looked revolutionary in demonstrations, operating them at scale was a completely different challenge. Charging infrastructure wasn't fully ready. Batteries added enormous weight. Cold weather reduced range. And replacing an entire diesel fleet would cost companies billions. Most executives didn't say this loudly because publicly questioning EV adoption sounded risky, but privately, many were searching for another option, and Cummins knew it by this point. Cummins had already spent more than a century inside the transportation industry. They understood something Silicon Valley often underestimated. Trucking companies care less about excitement and more about reliability. That's how Cummins became powerful in the first place. The company started in Indiana in 1919. Long before electric vehicles became mainstream conversation, at the time, diesel engines themselves were considered experimental. Plessy Cummins believed diesel technology could completely transform transportation, but convincing people wasn't easy. Gasoline dominated everything. Diesel engines were noisy, dirty, and unfamiliar. For years, the company struggled badly. But then Cummins discovered something important. In transportation, trust matters more than promises. Instead of marketing fantasies, they focused on proving endurance. Their engines survived impossible distances, extreme workloads, and military operations during wartime. Over decades, that reputation spread globally. Trucks powered by Cummins engines became associated with one thing above all else: dependability. And ironically, that same reputation later became a problem, because once governments began targeting emissions and climate goals, diesel companies suddenly looked like symbols of the past. New EV companies became the future. Investors chased battery startups. Instead of engine manufacturers, Cummins had two choices: defend diesel until the market abandoned them, or reinvent the engine itself. What they eventually created shocked almost everyone. The engine was called the X15N, and at first glance, it didn't sound revolutionary at all. It wasn't fully electric. It didn't look futuristic. There were no giant lead-filled launch events, no promises about colonizing Mars. It was simply a heavy-duty natural gas engine built for commercial transportation. But buried inside that decision was a strategy far more disruptive than people initially understood, because the X15N wasn't trying to replace electric trucks completely. It was trying to expose their Weaknesses. The engine ran primarily on natural gas and renewable fuels instead of diesel. That alone reduced emissions dramatically compared to traditional trucking engines. But what really got fleet operators interested was something else entirely. They didn't need to rebuild everything. Existing trucking systems could continue operating with far fewer disruptions. Routes stayed mostly the same. Refueling remained fast. Mechanics could adapt more easily. Companies avoided the nightmare of replacing entire infrastructures overnight, and suddenly the economics started becoming difficult to ignore. Fuel costs dropped compared to diesel in many regions. Maintenance intervals improved. The engine produced strong torque for hauling massive loads while remaining cleaner than older diesel systems. Some companies realized they could cut operational expenses significantly without waiting years for full EV infrastructure to mature. That's when reactions inside the industry began changing. At first, competitors dismissed the idea. Natural gas wasn't new. Alternative fuels had existed for years. But the deeper companies examined the X15N. The more uncomfortable the situation became. Because Cummins wasn't selling a futuristic dream. Strategy. And transition strategies are often more dangerous than revolutionary ideas because they solve immediate pain instead of promising distant perfection. This only became more obvious once fleet testing started expanding. Truck operators discovered the X15N fit into daily operations far more smoothly than expected. Long-distance routes remained practical. Downtime stayed manageable. Refueling times looked familiar compared to charging heavy EV operations. And then another realization started spreading quietly through the industry. What if the transportation future becomes fragmented instead of unified? For years, public discussions treated batteries as the single inevitable answer. But heavy transportation doesn't work like smartphone markets. Different regions have different infrastructure. Different industries face different operational realities. And Cummins designed the X15N around exactly that uncertainty. The engine platform was built with future fuel flexibility in mind. Today, it runs on natural gas and renewable fuels. But Cummins also prepared the system for hydrogen compatibility later on. That changed everything. Because now the company wasn't betting against clean energy. They were betting against certainty itself. Instead of assuming one technology would dominate globally, Cummins positioned itself to adapt no matter which direction infrastructure evolved. And suddenly, companies like Tesla, BYD, and even Toyota had a new problem to think about. Not because the X15N was more futuristic, but because it was more practical for the present moment. That distinction matters enormously. Most industries don't collapse overnight during transitions. They evolve in layers. Old systems survive longer than expected. New systems grow unevenly. Hybrid solutions dominate temporary periods that sometimes last decades. The trucking industry may now be entering exactly that phase. Electric vehicles will continue growing. That part is obvious. Battery technology will improve. Charging infrastructure will expand. But the X15N introduced a possibility many people ignored before. The road to the future may not be fully electric for a very long time. Instead, transportation could split into multiple competing systems, all existing together. Batteries in some markets, hydrogen in others, renewable fuels somewhere else. Hybrid fleets operating between all of them. And if that happens, companies built around flexibility become incredibly powerful. That's the part many people missed when Cummins first revealed the X15N. They thought Cummins was trying to save combustion engines, but maybe the company understood something deeper instead. In uncertain industries, the winners usually aren't the companies predicting one future perfectly. They're the companies prepared for several futures at the same time. And once you start looking at the transportation industry that way, the behavior of major companies suddenly makes a lot more sense, because behind all the public excitement around EV, there's still a quiet panic spreading through freight and logistics networks worldwide. Not panic about clean energy itself, but panic about timing. Most governments want faster transitions. Investors want faster transitions. Consumers expect faster transitions, but infrastructure moves slowly, and trucking companies live in reality. not headlines. A shipping company can't gamble billions of dollars on technology that might leave trucks stranded halfway through critical routes. A logistics operator can't explain delayed medical deliveries by saying charging stations were unavailable. Reliability always comes first. That's why some fleet executives started viewing the X15N less like an engine and more like insurance. Insurance against uncertainty. Because if EV infrastructure expands rapidly, great. They can gradually transition later. But if battery technology develops slower than expected, or hydrogen infrastructure takes decades longer, they still have a system capable of reducing emissions right now without destroying operations.